two colossal empires turned China into their slaughterhouse. But the Chinese emperor declared neutrality. 1904. The Russo-Japanese War. Hundreds of thousands died on soil that wasn't even theirs. Trapped in the crossfire, two forgotten women fought not for an empire, but to save a single child from the hellfire. This is a story of ultimate sacrifice and a spine that war could never break. In 1895, the snow fell heavy over Port Arthur, heavy enough to completely blanket the bloodstains pooling in the streets. At that time, the Far East was trapped in a nightmare from which it could not wake. Following the First Sino-Japanese War, the Qing dynasty had lost everything, forced to cede the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan. But immediately after, Russia, Germany, and France stepped in under the guise of upholding justice to force the triple intervention. Japan had to spit out the territory it had just swallowed, but turned around and extorted a staggering 30 million taels of silver from the Qing government as a ransom for Liaodong. The land was bought back with silver, but the restless spirits of those who died on that land didn't even have loved ones left to collect their bodies. In these snow-covered ruins, no one paid any attention to two freezing little girls. One was named Zhang. Emaciated and reduced to skin and bones, she fiercely guarded half a piece of blood-stained, steamed cornbread in her arms. The other was May, reaching out with hands so purple from the cold, she was moments away from drawing her last breath. In such desperate times, human instinct dictates hoarding whatever little lifeline you have left. But Zhang didn't. She looked up, didn't say a word, and forcefully broke off the larger piece of that cornbread, handing it over. This bloody half-bite of food, of course, could not save the rotting, decrepit Qing Empire. But it acted as an invisible, unbreakable thread, permanently tying the fates of these two displaced, destitute Chinese women together. The sheer absurdity of history began at exactly this moment. Robbed of its spoils, Japan swallowed its humiliation, poured all 30 million taels of silver into military expansion, and vowed to return. Meanwhile, Tsarist Russia, having just played the benevolent savior, bared its fangs. In 1898, they forced a lease of Port Arthur and Dalian, transforming the area into the most heavily fortified Pacific naval stronghold in the Far East. By 1900, using the Boxer Rebellion as a pretext, Russia sent 170,000 troops and swallowed the entirety of northeast China, Manchuria whole. By then, Zhang had grown up. She hauled coal sacks at the docks, sacks heavier than her own body. Sweat and black coal dust mixed together, caking her entire face. She never washed it. Because in a naval port swarming with foreign soldiers, a Chinese woman with a clean face was inviting disaster. And May? As a woman trapped in the local pleasure houses, her nights were forever spent in a blur of noise, cheap powder, and humiliation. Often, she could only drag her exhausted body back to their shelter in the pre-dawn hours, long after the patrons had dispersed. During the day, they occasionally brushed past each other on street corners. One, a coolie just finishing a shift at the docks. The other, a plaything, trudging home with a hangover. They acted like strangers, never even daring to make eye contact, terrified of bringing trouble to the other. But time always leaves a narrow seam. Whenever the night was at its darkest, just before dawn, or on the rare evening May had no patrons, Their dilapidated shack truly belonged to them. Zhang would bring a basin of scalding water and, bit by bit, with absolute gentleness, wipe away the bruises and scars on Mei's body. They would take the copper coins they saved from starving themselves and secretly stuff them into the cracks of the mud walls. They never dared to dream too big. Their greatest wish was simply to save enough money to buy a plot of land in the south. Even if it was just half an acre, so long as they couldn't hear the roar of artillery overhead, they would be content. They had no idea that two imperial behemoths had already designated their dreamland as the ultimate gambling table. By February 1904, the air carried the chill of early spring, but far colder than the weather was the killing intent. The political bickering at the negotiating table had finally reached its end. In the dead of night, on February 8th, torpedo boats of the Japanese combined fleet slipped silently into Port Arthur without a declaration of war. Chaos erupted across the dark waters. The Russian Pacific Fleet, caught completely off guard in the harbor, was devastated. Multiple flagship cruisers were crippled, trapped helplessly in the bay. In the blink of an eye, Tsarist Russia lost control of the surrounding seas. On that same day, Japanese forces forced a landing at Incheon, Korea, sweeping across the Korean peninsula with unstoppable momentum and turning it into a springboard for invading northeast China. The Russian Far East Fleet commander, Stepan Makarov, would soon die in battle. Russia's painstakingly built naval presence was teetering on the brink of annihilation. Yet, just as these two imperial robbers were sharpening their knives, ready to bash each other's brains out, a royal decree emerged from Beijing that sent a chill down the spine of every Chinese citizen. The Qing imperial court declared strict neutrality. What a deeply ironic phrase. Robbers carrying machetes have turned your home into a slaughterhouse, hacking at each other until blood soaks your living room floor. And you, the master of the house, stand outside the threshold with your hands behind your back, declaring this has nothing to do with you. The sovereign had reduced itself to a spectator. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in Port Arthur were simply abandoned in the crossfire of two foreign armies. 280 millimeters siege howitzers began their indiscriminate bombardment. Century-old streets and alleys shredded like paper under steel and fire. Foreigners, seeing red in their scramble to capture a hill, wouldn't spare a downward glance at the Chinese civilians who couldn't even find a drop of clean water to drink. But in that blackened smoke, Zhang tied her pant legs tight. Braving the screaming stray bullets, she risked her life to charge into a bombed-out Russian supply depot. She wasn't stealing. In this city trampled by foreign armies, she was merely taking back what originally belonged to the Chinese people. When she carried the heavy sacks of grain back to their cellar, she didn't say a word. She just looked at the terrified children they had sheltered and wiped down her kitchen cleaver. That spring, the flames of war were fully ignited. The Japanese army crossed the Yalu River, violently pushing the front line into Chinese territory. What followed was the Battle of Liaoyang, then the Battle of Shahe. Hundreds of thousands of troops slaughtered each other on the Black Earth, artillery shells churning the ground inside out. Tens of thousands of young lives fell amidst battle cries, turning into spring fertilizer. But behind the grand military dispatches of history, the lives of ordinary people plummeted in a straight line. The local magistrates fled. The government offices stood empty. The dragon flag of the Qing dynasty had long been discarded in some forgotten corner. In her yard, Zhang dug into the dirt, shovelful by shovelful. She wasn't preparing her own grave. She was digging an air-raid cellar for the neighborhood elders and children to hide from the shelling. May didn't rest either. Using the rare daylight hours when she wasn't forced to work, she took every last copper coin she had suffered to earn in the brothel and exchanged it for the coarsest brown rice and a few jugs of cheap liquor. The road south had long been entirely cut off by the war. This land beneath their feet, now covered in foreign boot prints, was their only home. Under the shadow of two colossal empires, these two women from the absolute bottom of society used their frail shoulders to hold up a battered yet uncrushable umbrella. By November, the war bared its ugliest, most manic fangs. The Japanese military threw the entirety of its forces at the absolute core of the Port Arthur stronghold 203-meter hill. It was a meat grinder with no avenue for retreat. The Japanese launched suicidal charge after suicidal charge. Thick clusters of soldiers fell on the slopes, corpses piling upon corpses, dyeing the entire mountain a shocking, horrific dark red. By December, the hill finally fell. The Japanese hauled heavy siege guns to the summit, gaining a vantage point that overlooked the entirety of Port Arthur. The remaining Russian warships in the harbor were reduced to burning heaps of scrap iron by the plunging fire, and those freezing artillery shells began raining down on the civilian districts. When disaster struck, there was no warning. A heavy shell deviated from its trajectory, screaming as it smashed into the slum where Zhang and Mei were holding out. The roof of their cellar instantly collapsed. Thousands of pounds of brick and stone slammed down, burying everything in dust and rubble. At that exact moment, Zhang was outside searching for fresh water. Hearing the deafening explosion, she ran back like a madwoman. Beneath the collapsed ruins, Mei could have relied on her quick reflexes to crawl out of the fractured opening alone. Sunlight was already shining on her face. If she took one step forward, she would live. But she stopped. She looked back. In a shadowed corner, she saw a terrified child, shivering so hard he couldn't even force out a cry. It was little Stone, an orphan they had taken in from the war zone. In that split second, Mei didn't think twice. She turned around, using that very body that had suffered endless humiliation in the brothels, that body looked down upon by the entire world, and lunged over the child like a mother hen shielding her chick. Tons of brick and stone crashed down. The sound of Mei's spine snapping was drowned out by the rolling thunder of distant artillery. When Zhang frantically tore through the ruins with her bare hands, clawing away the boulders, little Stone sat there entirely unharmed, crying weakly. But Mei's lower half was a bloody, mangled mess, crushed entirely into the earth. She didn't cry out in pain. She only struggled to raise a blood-soaked hand, gently grasping the edge of Zhang's shirt. Her eyes looked exactly the way they had years ago in the freezing snow, when Zhang had handed her that half a piece of cornbread, clean, clear, and carrying the profound peace of final liberation. Zhang did not shed a tear. In an era where even tears felt like a luxury, she just bit her lip and hoisted the dying Mei onto her back. She ran like a lunatic through the blinding blizzard, aiming for the only field hospital in the city where the Russians had hoarded medicine and bandages. In her mind, as long as she could find a doctor, May could be saved. But when she finally arrived, panting and desperate, carrying May to the hospital doors, she wasn't met with the healing hands of a doctor. She was met with cold rifle barrels. They were the rifles of Russian guards. They looked with absolute disgust at this mud-covered Chinese woman, spitting out a few words in stiff, arrogant Chinese. Chinese dog, get out. The butt of a rifle smashed brutally into Zhang's forehead. Blood trailed down the corner of her eye. The bitter wind howled through the ruined walls. Zhang sat in the freezing snow, holding May, whose body temperature was slowly slipping away. She didn't try to charge the door again. She knew May's life had reached its end. Using her final ounce of strength, May didn't reach up to touch Zhang's face. Her pale, trembling finger pointed toward Little Stone, who was crying out in terror beside them. She didn't say a word. She only looked at Zhang with a heavy gaze that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Zhang understood exactly what that look meant. Live on, survive. Zhang bit down hard on her own lip until it bled. Blood mixed with tears as she gave a fierce, resolute nod. May smiled. On that freezing winter night, she closed her eyes, forever remaining on this ravaged, scarred earth that had always belonged to them. Time marched to the autumn of 1905. On the docks of Port Arthur, the double-headed eagle flag of the Russians was slowly lowered. In its place rose the rising sun flag of the Japanese. Shortly after, mediated across the ocean, the two nations signed the Treaty of Portsmouth. Tsarist Russia handed over the lease of Port Arthur and Dalian, along with control of the South Manchuria Railway, to Japan on a silver platter. This war, which slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, concluded in the most grotesque and absurd manner imaginable. The robbers divided their spoils, dusted off their hands, and walked away. Yet the Qing Empire, the true master of this land, never even got a chair at the negotiating table from start to finish. A greedy bear was driven out only for a vicious wolf to take its place. The vast lands of northeast China were thoroughly reduced to a playground for Japanese militarism, burying the deepest seeds for the long, unimaginable suffering that was yet to come. The port had a new master. The Qing officials, wearing their traditional robes, scurried back to shore on small boats, bags in hand. They knew how to bow to the Russians, and naturally, they knew how to smile even more obsequiously at their new Japanese overlords. Decades had passed. The queues on their heads had been cut, the robes on their backs had changed. Yet the spines of those high and mighty men had never truly stood straight. But on a hillside outside Port Arthur, a hill sheared in half by artillery fire, the setting sun stretched their shadows incredibly long. Zhang held the hand of a much taller Little Stone, standing on the ridge. The freezing wind whipped at her patched jacket. She didn't speak, but her silhouette stood like an unbending steel blade, driven deep into the bedrock. Artillery fire can level a city. It can obliterate countless bricks and tiles, but it could never, ever break the straight, unyielding spine of a Chinese woman from the absolute bottom of the earth. Zhang bent down. With hands covered in thick calluses, incredibly rough to the touch, she gently wiped the dirt from Little Stone's face. She turned her head, looking down the mountain at the foreign armies marching in formation, flaunting their might. Word by word, She let her voice melt into the wind. Remember today. Remember the foreigners' cannons. And remember Auntie May, who gave her life to protect you. When you grow up, take our land back, fair and square, with your head held high.